Welcome back, everyone, to week 15. This week we are looking at Dada and Surrealism. And these are two art movements that very much flow one into the other, as many of the others we've been seeing. And they happen simultaneously with what we looked at last week in the early 20th century. Now, look at this iron. Wouldn't you want to iron with this? Well, this is Dada. If you're looking at this going like, well, they completely ruined it. You can't iron with an iron with spikes on it. That is the whole point of Dada and to an extent surrealism. So what is Dada? So Dada exists only for a very short period of time. And this is because Dada is anti-war, which makes sense because it is a reaction to the First World War. It is anti-materialistic, which is hard when you make art objects. It is anti nationalistic. It is also anti Dada. So it Dada is what you're thinking. It's an anarchist dream art movement. But unfortunately, when your art movement is anti itself, it can't last very long. You can't really have a political manifesto, as many of these early 20th century art movements are going to have, because you're basically an anarchist. They rejected traditional art standards, and this again is very much like other art movements of this time period. But here is where we see a difference. So they use nonsense, such as an iron with spikes, making the functional unfunctionable, which I don't think is a word. They used nonsense to represent the senselessness of war and violence. So, to kind of delve a little bit deeper into this concept, after the First World War, people were devastated. They felt that everything that they had held as the ideals of humanity and civilization, a lot of those things that were established as far back as the Renaissance, but really developed in the Enlightenment, the idea of logic and common sense and fraternity and education, all of those things, equality, quote unquote, right? All of those things had only led to death and destruction. Civilization itself only led to death and destruction. So the reaction to that was our way of living our lives does not make sense. None of this makes sense because war, of course, absolutely does not make sense, right? And so they reflected this through their art. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more as we go through the slides. So here is one of these pieces. So again, because they're anti-materialistic, many of these are performance pieces, meaning they blur the line between performance art and studio art, visual arts, and between what is art and what is not art. So this is Hugo Ball reciting the poem, and this is the poem itself. If you're confused as to what it says, it doesn't say anything at all. It is gibberish. So he stood there in this, and this is one of the very few photographs we have of this performance. It's kind of like weird spacesuit with this thing around his shoulder and this like almost dunce cap on his head, and then he had like claws as hands, and then he basically recited this gibberish poem, and that was the piece. It was meant to make you feel uncomfortable and confused. That was the whole point of Dada, to make you realize how senseless and nonsensical civilization and humanity was. And by the way, there were a series of these Dada performances done at the Café Voltaire. And I'm going to play you a video in the next section that delves a little bit more into Dadaism and these performances, and actually performance art, perhaps, in general. Now, here we meet one of our favorite friends of the early 20th century, and that is Marcel Duchamp. So Marcel Duchamp, he really liked pushing the limits. Let's just say it like that. He dabbled in a lot of different art forms, and he was very much anti-establishment and anti the established art movements. So here we have, these are ready-mades, and so what they are assembled pieces. This is a chair with a bike wheel on it attached. We also have Sophie Tauber ARP, which is a mouthful. And this is one of her pieces. Again, it's nonsensical. It's not meant to represent anything in particular, although it's called Military Guards here. It really is about bending the rules of what is art and what are art materials. This is another Duchamp. So if you've ever seen this, this is not a joke. This is an actual piece of art. So Duchamp, like I said, he really liked pushing the limits, and he really poked fun at the art establishment. And of course, what is most sacred in the art establishment than the Mona Lisa itself? So he took a print of the Mona Lisa, he painted a mustache and a beard on it, and those initials down there basically translate to she has a nice bum, but not exactly in those exact words. So you can just imagine what it says. And of course, this outraged people, and Duchamp really is the king of the shock and awe type of artwork that's still prevalent today. There's a lot of artists that use shock and awe. I mean, in the early 90s, there were artists such as Damien Hirst who liked to put entire animals, cut them up, and put them in tanks of formaldehyde and exhibit them. There were other artists who, posted images of themselves in the middle of intercourse on billboards. So this is not necessarily the most shock and awe type of artwork that we've seen in our generation, but for its time, it was incredibly outrageous. Here we have Raoul Hausmann's The Critic. We also see the advent of collage during this time period, and a lot of it is highly political. And when you hear the word collage, you immediately think back to like making collages in grade school, but this is a very different type of collage. It is, again, drawing on some of the same influences as early abstraction and cubism with the use of words and newspaper, but here it's being used to create these new images, and they're often satirical. This is perhaps one of the most famous. This is Hannah Hosch's Cut with the Kitchen Knife, and the title goes on forever, but this is kind of the abbreviated title, and there is so much going on in this piece. Hopefully you watched the video on it that I believe was in your reading. And this is what collage for the Dada, and you can actually see the word Dada down there, is all about. It's chaotic and contradictory, right? So it doesn't have one main theme. There's something going on all over, right? There's images of German military leaders, Dada artists, dancers, animals, all sorts of things. There's a self-portrait of Hush herself in the lower corner. And this word Dada, I didn't explain it before, but Dada, in case you're wondering, doesn't actually mean anything. We've had a lot of art movements where the name is given afterwards, kind of as a derogatory sort of name for the art movement. The Dadaists name themselves, and they choose Dada because it doesn't really mean anything in most languages, at least at the time that they were kind of researching names. And so you'll see it spelled different, like capitalized differently. It's not meant to mean anything in any language. And this is what we call also a photo montage. So a photo montage is basically the Photoshop of the early 20th century. So what you would do is you would cut out photographs and stitch them together, and sometimes hyper realistically, as I might show you at the very end of this lecture, in order to create a new image, and then you would photograph that image and you would have a single photograph. So that's a photo montage. In terms of the ready-mades, I kind of mentioned them briefly before. This is Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain. And I'm not sure if I showed you this at the very beginning of the semester, but this is a ready-made sculpture. A ready-made sculpture is taking objects that are already created and putting them on a pedestal with very minor interventions. So in this case, he flipped it over and he wrote his name on it, or his alias here, and the date. Other ready-made sculptures, sometimes there are a combination of different already made objects, as we saw before. And this continues to be one of the most infamous pieces of modern art that has ever existed, I would say. And when SF MoMA reopens someday, you can actually see a copy of, well, it's one of the versions. There's several of them around the world. One of the original copies that Duchamp later made when this piece became famous, because of course you can just make as many fountains as you want. You just need the urinals. All right. Now, like I said, Dadaism didn't last long because all of its members could not agree on a particular manifesto. They were all very kind of nonsensical, and that's really hard to keep an actual art movement alive in those cases. So what develops out of Dadaism is Surrealism, and you probably have heard of Surrealism before. Like I said, it developed out of the Dada movement, and it attempts to express the workings of the subconscious. So it takes part of what the Dadaists were saying and they develop it further, because this is the era of psychoanalysis and of Freud. And if you are a psychology major, this is kind of your art movement, because a lot of early 20th century psychology is involved in this art movement. And so they take the idea of kind of the reaction to the First World War, that everything was nonsensical and civilization had taken us nowhere, and again tapping into psychoanalysis, the idea that the conscious mind, right, which we use every day, had basically just led us to kill each other in vast quantities, which was the First World War. And they said, we can change it. So again, here, the call for a new world order after every large war like this, a world war, an epidemic, there is always a call to change the world order, because people are fundamentally changed inside, and so they need to see kind of change reflected in their society. And the surrealists felt that this could be achieved by tapping into your subconscious and kind of balancing out your subconscious with your conscious. And if we could do that, then we would never have something as horrible as World War One. Kind of spoiler, a couple years later, there's a World War II. So it doesn't work. But the art that is produced during this time is absolutely amazing, imaginative, and kind of the height of creativity in the arts. So we are going to see the juxtaposition of fantastic imagery, and I'll go a little bit over what that means. But juxtaposition just means putting together two things that don't make sense together. Kind of like a teacup that is furry. It doesn't make sense. So that is a really good surrealist image, because it kind of jars you out of your conscious state of being and it makes you question the world around you. And we're going to see two types of surrealism: dream surrealism and automatism. Let's see. So some other characteristics of surrealism, and again, this is a piece that I picked out especially because it is usually on display at SF MoMA. So elements of surprise, again, like a teacup being furry, or the scaling on these pieces in this piece. Unexpected juxtapositions, a room with clouds inside. What is it? Are we outside? Are we inside? Distortion of reality. Everything is huge. I mean, that hair comb is bigger than the bed, right? So it distorts our reality. We know that there's something strange. This is a dream type of surrealism in that it almost feels like you're in one of those very strange dreams. Again, an interest in the subconscious, so you're going to see a lot of eye imagery for those of you that like to doodle eyes on your pieces of paper. And it is magical and often instinctive. So as for automatism, it was a means for expressing the subconscious. Now, this class I usually really enjoy teaching because we do several experiments in class dealing with the subconscious. It's a little bit harder to do as you're all at home and not next to each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to just do this particular exercise. So I need you to grab a piece of scratch paper, and you can pause the video while you do that. All right, so hopefully you're back. You have something to write with and a piece of scratch paper. So what I want you to do is put your pen on the piece of paper and just draw. But don't let your mind interfere. So some people like to close their eyes, some people like to look away, but you're just moving your pen or pencil or crayon, I don't know what you're writing with, across your paper. And you're going to do this for around 15-20 seconds. So again, you can pause the video for a few seconds. All right, so hopefully you did the exercise, and I'm not just kind of talking to myself, although it sometimes feels like I'm just talking to myself here. And what you have is your subconscious. So what does your subconscious looks like, right? This is André Masson's subconscious. This is an automatic drawing by Masson from the late uh, from the late 19th century. So he was already kind of experimenting with these ideas very early on. And he's later going to go on to be one of the surrealists. Now, you might be wondering, like, what is this all about? Like, how is this useful? These are just scribbles. Well, then we see objects like exquisite corpse being created. And again, this is an activity I do in class, but basically each person creates a part of this exquisite corpse. So somebody would do the head, and then you would pass the paper, and somebody would draw a body without seeing the head, and then somebody would draw the legs. And so what you get are kind of these fantastical creatures, which none of us would have been able to come up with on our own. So again, it's tapping into your imagination, right? If there's anything I always say that college students love to overthink everything, and you know I'm talking about you. And so what automatic drawing and exquisite corpses and these type of art exercises do is they kind of free up that part of your brain that overanalyzes everything, and they just kind of tap into that childhood kind of feeling of freedom and creativity and imagination before all of the rules of civilization were really established in your brain. And then artists would then take pieces of these exquisite corpses or their automatic drawings and create really beautiful, interesting images and paintings out of them, and sometimes 3D art pieces as well. I don't know what this image is. Oh, here we have an example of what do you do with these automatic drawings and these kind of gibberish sketches. Well, you can create something like Miro's Harlequin's Carnival, and you can see how this really does stem out of doodles. But it is creative, it is fun, and it is imaginative, right? Which is all of these things that surrealism really taps into. Now, make no mistake, surrealism was very much a political movement. And I'm going to have you watch a video that talks about Dali, Salvador Dali, and how Salvador Dali really brought the fun back into surrealism because it started as a political art movement. Some of the artists had a lot of fun with it, but it really came back to its political roots. And Salvador Dali was like, I'm not about that. I really just kind of want to have fun and experiment and really tap into the subconscious. And so I hope you watch that video. It is incredibly It's incredibly fun and really sneaks us into the mind of one of the greatest surrealists of our time, Salvador Dali. And as a side note, my dog is named after Salvador Dali too. Although people tell me he looks more like Rod Stewart than Salvador Dali. So I'll let you imagine what a dog that looks like Rod Stewart looks like. But I digress. Back to surrealism. So this is Rene Magritte. This is not a pipe. This is a surrealist piece, even though it's much later. It is a pipe, but is it? If it's not a pipe, what is it? It's an image of a pipe. But also, Magritte here is messing with your mind because you're instantly confused, right? You're like, I'm seeing this hyper realistic pipe, but then there's text that tells me it's not a pipe. So it's challenging your brain in that you're used to believing text. Do you believe text and the written word, or do you believe what your eye sees? And it's really all just an illusion, which is what surrealism is trying to get to. Here we have some of Dali's most famous works. This is The Persistence of Memory. And I happen to love this piece because I'm always trying to figure out what that like creature. To me, it looks like a creature, but it doesn't even have an eye, so I don't know why I think it's a creature. And they draw you in because you see all of these images that might be real. Like he's using perspective, and some of these images are hyper realistic, but then the clock is melting, and so it just jars you right out of reality and into this dreamscape. Here we have another piece. This is Difficult Crossing. The bell pepper that we have talked about before. So photographers jump right into this art movement. And what you probably have noticed as these pieces go for far longer after World War II begins. And it's true because surrealism, although the main art movement really kind of struggles to stay afloat as a political movement with the advent of the Second World War, the influence of surrealism continues to influence artists much later on. Uh, in the film you're going to watch about Dali, there's also talks about early film and surrealist film, and it's strange. You can actually look up this film on YouTube. I usually don't show it in its entirety in my class because it is just very strange. There are some strange things happening. But if you have extra time because you're just sitting at home, it might be worth a look at Un Chien Andalou, which is basically an Andalusian dog. All right, so I was talking about the deep, lasting influence of surrealism. Now, Frida Kahlo is a really interesting example. Again, she is an artist that is coming from Mexico, and these art movements really do become global during this time. So Frida is aware of surrealism and all of those schools of thoughts. She never aligns herself and she never calls herself a surrealist, but the influence is clear as daylight. I mean, there's a lot of other types of artwork that are going to influence her work, but the influence of the surrealist is definitely there. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Kahlo. It says, "I paint my own reality. The only thing I know is that I paint because I need to, and I paint whatever passes through my head without any other consideration." And if that sounds quite a bit like automatism, it's because it does sound like it. And so this is a work from 1945. It's called Moses, or Nucleus of Creation. And I love this piece because it's almost like a Who's Waldo of anybody in world history. So you have Nefertiti, you have Gandhi, uh, you have Genghis Khan, and then on this side, we have Jesus, we have Napoleon and Hitler, and I mean, all of these people kind of sitting basically posed right next to each other. And then you have world religions, and what's fascinating here is you have everything from Botticelli's Venus, Egyptian gods, um, Eastern Orthodox uh, idols, to Huitzilopochtli, which is an Aztec god. So you have the full gamut here. And in the very center, oh, and I forgot to mention Karl Marx, because, Frida Kahlo was a staunch socialist communist, just FYI. So in the center, though, we have this womb and this child being born, and actually insemination actually happening right before our eyes. And you will notice in Frida's work, it is deeply personal, even when it is at this scale. And Frida Kahlo's life, a lot of you are familiar with it, but she came from a pretty well-to-do family, and she had a horrible accident early on in her life, which basically left her with terrible pain for the rest of her life. She was bedbound for many months, and the only thing she could do was basically lie on her back. And so she started painting, and the only thing around her was a mirror. So she painted herself and she painted her family, and that's where she kind of got into the tradition of painting the world around her, painting herself. She has many, many self portraits. But this accident also made it so that she was never able to carry a birth. And carry a child to birth, and so she had many miscarriages. And for her, self identity, not being able to have a child was devastating, and we see this over and over in her imagery. And so this is also reflective of what I mentioned about 20th century artists really tapping into themselves and expressing their own individual feelings and world, as opposed to painters and sculptors earlier on. Another very, very popular imagery in Frida's work. Among them is Diego Rivera. So Diego Rivera, she had a very complicated relationship with this man. He was very much older. I think he was about 20 years older than her. He was already an established painter. He was painting at the school right next to the one she went, a building right next to the school she went, and so that's where she got to know him. She later became an art student, and they had an affair. They got married. But Diego really loved his women. He was kind of like a Picasso. He loved his women, and he didn't care that he was married. And so this created a great strain on their relationship. They eventually divorce, and then Frida goes on to have affairs with all sorts of people. She has affairs with political left wing leaders. She has affairs with other women. But for the rest of her life, Diego is going to be the greatest love of her life. And so you see him often represented either as a baby or as her third eye. And the last image I'm going to show you is kind of pushing us even further into the present. And this is Greta Stern. And Greta Stern was German, but she immigrated to Argentina during the Second World War. During or right after the Second World War, I believe. And she was living in Argentina at this kind of in the 1940s, 50s. And this is a time when, again, psychoanalysis was huge. So there was this magazine that it was something like Interpret Your Dreams, and people would write into these psychoanalysis kind of columns, and psychologists would give them, like, basically interpret their dreams. People would write their dreams, the doctors would interpret them, and the doctors were very much 1940s and 50s men, and that they enforced the status quo, and they basically told women to be good women, good housewives and all of that. However, Greta Stern was hired to do these photo montages for this magazine, and all of her work completely undermines what the doctors were saying, because she in her work is kind of showing the status of women, often the freedom of women, and often some of the things that they go through in the workplace. I mean, this image right here, right, doesn't even seem like it's from the 1950s. It could be an image that could describe the workplace today, as we've seen with the Me Too movement. Well, artists were already grappling with these ideas even in the 40s and 50s, and they often grappled with them in really creative and innovative ways. So I wanted to bring you Greta Stern, and she is also creating photo montages. So again, she would take photographs and then expertly cut them out with a penknife, and then she would assemble them together and re-photograph them, and you can't even see where the lines for those photographs are. So I'm going to wrap up there. You will have a couple of videos to watch in the next section, and just kind of delve a little bit deeper into Dada and surrealism, and I will see all of you next week.